Welcome back to the Morning Show here on Rise News. Joining us now from our Abuja studio is human rights activist and lawyer Dr. Chidi Odinkalu. He is a leading voice in the human rights movement in Nigeria and served as chairman of the country's National Human Rights Commission. He currently heads the African program of the Open Society Justice Initiative. Welcome to the Morning Show. All right, let's actually start it off. As a human rights activist, there were a lot of works and a lot of activism done by several bodies leading up to the 2015 election. We cannot say the same as we actually build up to the 2019 election. What has actually changed? Is it that human rights activist groups have actually succumbed to the pressure of the government of the day, or what is really happening?
I'm not quite, I don't know how accurate that is. Look, it's not human rights activists running for office, it's politicians, and political parties are the people fielding candidates in elections. It's up to political parties and politicians to ensure that there is excitement, there is awareness, there is enlightenment, there is a campaign that rivets people and holds their attention. At the moment, that is not happening. On the contrary, actually, it seems to me that the little activity that you've got is coming from the human rights activists, or howsoever called. We've had the Christmas, all of the kerfuffle about Amnesty International and what they did and didn't do. You've had post that, the Daily Trust and the reportage on the situation in the Northeast. Before that, you had the problem with UNICEF and the military and government complaining about their work. It's actually, the agenda has been set by everybody other than the politicians. And I think it's time to ask the Nigerian politicians to step up to the plate and take their responsibilities seriously.
Well, the campaigns are in full swing and the political gladiators are all out. What do you make of the campaign so far? Are you impressed?
Nope. As you can guess from what I've just said, the campaigns have been entirely unimpressive. Reading in the papers this morning that the president is alleged to have said that there is no money and people should campaign by text messages and stuff. I don't know how accurate that is. That's why I say it's alleged. But wherever you go, the evidence of a campaign for the most competitive offices with dispositive implications for the country is just not there. And something is wrong. It's the two leading parties are hollows of what they're supposed to be. The other parties are not sufficiently, don't seem at the moment to be sufficiently insurgent to excite anybody. And so the landscape of political competition is devoid of the kind of excitement you'd expect at this particular time for the kind of contest that the country is looking for next month. This is a major departure from what we had in 2015.
Perhaps, have you availed yourself of the election guidelines as released by INEC for the 2019 elections? And what do you make of it?
They are not spectacularly different from the 2015 guidelines. There are some minor modifications. For instance, they've now created this thing called voting point settlement. In 2015, you had polling units and voting points for polling units that had more than, I believe, 500 voters. Now, in addition to polling units and voting points, the 2018 or 2019 guidelines, which were published on the 21st of last month, talk about voting point settlements. I am waiting for INEC to clarify what that means and how that's going to work. But that is a potential minefield if it's not navigated carefully enough. The second area of difference is what happens when a name does not show up, a voter, there is discrepancy between a voter who presents themselves and the information held in the machine. Now, in 2015, you were going to have an incident form. Now, the incident form has been eliminated as such, but it's not very clear to me that what they've put in its place will preclude community voting. For me, those are the two major areas of difficulty in the guidelines as at this moment.
But the voting point settlement in the new guideline, INEC says is the same as polling units.
There are 119,978 polling units in the country. Let me repeat. There are 119,978 polling units in the country. Now, INEC has not disclosed how many of those polling units have over 500 or 750 registered voters. According to these new guidelines, a voting point settlement is a new settlement that is not covered by existing polling units. I may have my suspicions, which would include the possibility that these so-called voting point settlements are supposed to be for internally displaced persons or could cover internally displaced persons. The problem is that if you don't designate the so-called voting point settlements early enough, what you could end up with is people making it up as they go along. And I just said it's a potential minefield. And in addition to that, it is potentially an avenue for skewing the voting process. And what INEC needs to do is to be as transparent as possible early on, upfront, about how it's going to constitute these and how many there are likely to be and where they're going to be. It needs to do that pronto. At the moment, there is not that information.
But Dr. Odinkalu, according to the guideline, let me state this specifically, Section 3, subsection D states that where a voting point settlement is created, it will be treated as a polling unit.
Exactly. If it is created, it will be treated as. Now, we know where the polling units are. We know how many they are. How many voting point settlements are there in the country? How many, on the basis of what criteria will they be created? We don't know. And that's not good enough. And nobody knew of this concept of voting point settlements before the 21st of December 2018, when INEC published these guidelines. That is the problem. And the guidelines do not say with reference to what criteria voting point settlements will be created. And let me be clear about this. As I said, I suspect that these voting point settlements are supposed to address the problem of internal displacement, amongst other things. Now, the assumption is that internally displaced people are only to be found in those parts of northern Nigeria where there are conflicts. That's in the northeast and in the northwest and parts of the middle belt with the herdsmen crisis. That is not true. There are internally displaced persons all over Nigeria. In the south of Nigeria, there are huge problems of internal displacement in the south-south with inundation and flooding, and in the southeast with erosion. If you go to Anambra State, a settlement like Nanka, which is the central senatorial zone, has been almost totally wiped out by erosion. And the people of Nanka have mostly been displaced to places like Ekulobia and Oko and other parts of Anambra State. Now, these people will not be covered by voting point settlements. If you go to Bayelsa, lots of people from Brass, for instance, are now in Yanagua, displaced by inundation. They will not be covered by voting point settlements. In Anambra State, Aguleri and Umuleri are always flooded, and you will not find them in voting point settlements. But we will claim that voting point settlements will be set up for only those parts of the country where there is a shooting war. That is going to cause serious problems. And I think people have got to be fairly careful about how they handle that.
All right, so Dr. Odinkalu, so we asked that, why is it that civil society organizations are not insisting that either be more transparent about these voting point settlements, so that they'll be open, more importantly, so that there won't be more voting point settlements in some part of the country than others?
The people who must insist are not civil society. It's the politicians who are running for office. Why should civil society place its body in the path of bullets for politicians who are unwilling to do their work? The other thing is that, sadly, we are a very oral society. People don't read a lot in Nigeria. The INEC regulations run into 31 pages. The number of people that I know in this country who will take time to go through those regulations isn't a heck of a lot of people. I can't find 100 Nigerians who have no other interest, who are not politicians or paid by politicians, who can simply sit down and go through those regulations for how they are going to affect the elections. And I can assure you that there are not too many people who have bothered to read page 1 of those regulations. Perhaps a few journalists, you know, political anoraks, possibly, but not too many other people.
The reason why we keep asking this question about civil society organizations is because you play a critical role in entrenching democracy and ensuring that there are free, credible elections.
Civil society does not have any greater interest in elections than every other Nigerian. Elections are for citizens. Every citizen has got a role, particularly adult citizens, and every citizen has got one vote, and that includes any member of the civil society. No member of the civil society has got a greater stake in Nigeria's elections than any other person, and certainly not more than the politicians who are running for office. We've got just about 1,500 elective positions. We've got 93 political parties. The politicians are not piping up, and somehow you want me to sit down here and say that civil society should be the avatars of politicians. I'm not going to say that because that's wrong. The politicians have got to show up and be counted. That is why they took the time to file to run for office. At the moment, they're not doing that, and we've got to call them out and say they're not doing well enough. How is it that we're running, we have elections in less than 40 days, and politicians are not getting the country revved up, and somehow we expect civil society to do it? How is that going to happen? And when civil society does it, the politicians are going to take over power and do what with it? Power that they've not canvassed for, and civil society that's not canvassed for power is going to do what? That's what I don't understand. We need to call the politicians out and tell them, get the hell out there and do something useful. At the moment, they're not.
All right, Dr. Odinkalu, INEC has ruled out the electronic transmission of results. Talking about the INEC chairman, Dr. Mahmoud Yakubu, says that the commission, that he has disclosed that rather that full electronic transmission of results will be done, because if there's no backing of the law, they cannot transmit full electronic transmission of results, so to speak.
The electoral bill that was vetoed by the president was supposed to provide for electronic transmission of results from the polling units to the headquarters in the only national single constituency election that we've got, particularly, which is the presidency. Because historically, problems with elections in the country has never really been the voting, it's been the counting and the collation. And the collation has been problematic because it's multi-stage. You go from polling units to wards, to local governments, to states, to the federal level, national level. And by the time you pass through all of these stages, results then get manipulated and figures get rewritten and different things happen along the way. So that bill was supposed to cure that defect. It has not been allowed to happen, and that's part of the reason why a lot of people think that the veto was not done with the best interests of the country at heart. But we're over that now, or at least we've got to run the elections in the full knowledge that we're not going to have that. I still would have thought, actually, that it's well within the parameters of INEC's powers under the Electoral Act 2015, or 2010-2015, to have governed that by guidelines. But even in the absence of that, there is nothing that says that INEC cannot set that process up as a process of informal verification and internal governance of its processes of election transmission. That's where I differ from the chairperson of INEC, because I do think that there are ways and means of managing that short of having it governing the results declaration process. But if INEC does not have any mechanism of checking the corruption of results between the polling unit and the headquarters, we're going to end up with rigged elections. I'm quite confident about that.
While everybody seems to be holding INEC's feet to the fire to prosecute a credible, free and fair election, other stakeholders seem to have been dropping the ball. You rightly mentioned the role of the political parties in campaigns and the process building up to the elections. But how about the people? Recently, the INEC chairman has raised an alarm over the buying of PVCs, permanent voter cards, by political parties. Do the Nigerian populace actually seem ready for a free, fair, and credible election, in your own opinion?
My personal view is that Nigerian citizens are, by and large, very decent people. And Nigerian citizens want the best for ourselves. And this is irrespective of where we come from. But we've not always had leaders that deserve the kind of people that we are. Yes, it's true, INEC chairman has said this. I'm also not convinced that INEC has done the best that it could to avert the buying of PVCs. The transaction cost in the PVC process is too high for citizens. Look, you're supposed to do the data inputting or present yourself for data collection. After that, you're going to spend lots and lots of time trying to get it. You're going to have, it involves travel for most people to their local government headquarters or to state capitals. All of that transaction cost could have been eliminated. Because of that high transaction cost imposed on citizens, it's just natural that people are going to negotiate what's the easiest way or the least expensive way to get this thing. Because you also have to understand that in many states, governments have now imposed possession of the PVC as a minimal requirement for access to public services. If that is the case, then it's only natural that you're going to have what the INEC chairman is complaining about. That's not rocket science. What I have not seen is how INEC has sought to mediate or get involved in ensuring that it reduces the transaction cost. It's only Nigeria where you impose this level of transaction cost on citizens for the exercise of a minimal civic right. In most other places that I know of across the world, including in Africa, citizens wait to get their civic demographics services provided to them. And I'd like to think that we can do much better than we have done in this case.
All right, Dr. Odinkalu, let's actually move on to security. Looking at how things have actually played out with the recent violence that barred the flag of the Lagos State gubernatorial candidates campaign here in Lagos State. Are we doing enough to curb electoral violence leading up to the elections? And what do we need to do to ensure that we do not witness any kind of electoral violence in the forthcoming elections?
We could spend a century discussing the issue of elections and violence in Nigeria because it's got a long history. I think it's only just proper to convey condolences to all those affected by the violence. I don't think any citizen should be killed because politicians are running for office. I think in the Lagos incident, 3 people have now been confirmed or reported dead. In Katsina yesterday, at least 10 were killed. And the numbers could easily spiral. It says something about our political system that politicians are willing to tolerate that toll just because of the temporal competition for access to power. It should not be happening. What can we do? There's a role for everybody to play here, from citizens like you and I to the politicians who are running for office to the security services. And we've got different kinds of violence. We've got structural violence. And we've got chronic violence in different parts of the country. I've mentioned the Northeast. There's the Northwest with the so-called bandits. There's the Middle Belt with the so-called herdsmen and farmers problem. But you've also got the South-South with militia movements. You've got IPOB and the secessionist movement in the Southeast. And then you've got cults across the board, particularly in the Southwest and South-South and parts of the Southeast. So there's structural violence and chronic violence in that sense. Add to that the issue of politicians importing guns. We've got a massive problem of drugs, psychotropic substances, including opioids and dependencies based on that. And then you've got the competition over political office. And what you have is a very toxic brew. So what do we do? The security services have got to step up. And at the moment, they're not doing that. There is also a perception that the security services are not particularly well governed, and to the extent that they are governed, that they have political leanings. The Inspector General of Police has done 35 years in the police force. He should have retired, but he's still there. And he's going to be 60 years next week. And people are waiting because the suspicion is that the president has extended him. And the Arise interview that took place with the president, you did pose that question to the president, and he did not answer it satisfactorily, what he was going to do with the Inspector General. And that perception of partiality in the security services leads people to a sense or a disposition of vigilantism, which also feeds the spiral in violence. So we really, there's a role for everybody here, and at the moment, most people are failing or dropping the ball in these roles.
Let's talk about the issue of human rights, Dr. Odinkalu. Recently, the NBA, Nigerian Bar Association, took a swipe at the President Muhammadu Buhari administration in its New Year message to Nigerians by its president, Mr. Paul Usoro. He said there has been an increase of human rights abuses and disregard for court orders. Now, you were head of the National Human Rights Commission at some point. Could you paint a clearer picture for us? Because you've also been paying attention closely to the civic space. Can you paint a picture for us? Has human rights abuses increased under this administration?
Well, I don't know, to be perfectly honest with you, whether or not human rights abuses have increased. But because I always address this with a caveat, every society is work in progress, and there is no society without violations. That said, the problem, I think that the problem of disobedience of court orders has increased under the current administration. And the president has provided his own doctrinal justification for it in saying that national security trumps the rule of law and human rights observance. The problem is who arbitrates when there is a tension, so-called, between national security and human rights. And the way he posits it, or the way he puts it, that arbitration, the final decision lies with the president, who himself is a political actor and a self-interested actor in that contest that he puts forward between human rights and the rule of law. And that is part of the reason why we have our current crisis in Nigeria, because politicians like the president and people like him don't want to respect the rule of law, and therefore they are driving people into the rule of force, or the law of rule, as I like to call it. And they have driven people into that through disobedience of court orders, through the denudation of civilized dispute resolution, and through the degradation of institutions that are supposed to be there for all of us. And the problem is, the day these people leave power, they will not have the protections they need to be able to live normal lives. And then they will go back to the same courts that they abused to get protection. I do think that the problem of disobedience of court orders has got to be addressed. And you now see that in even public institutions resorting to vigilantism. Why will the army go to harass Daily Trust the way it did? Because they believe they can do that. Why would they kill over 1,000 Shiites? Because they believe they can do that and get away with it. Why would they shoot Shiites on the streets of Abuja? Because they think they can get away with it. And a country that is run that way cannot survive. None of us is safe. So you don't, look, I allow for the possibility that Daily Trust may have violated something. If they did, what happened is the military authorities should have lodged a complaint with the police or with the SSS. The SSS would proceed to get the proper warrants, or police get the proper warrants and go and execute the warrants on the premises of Daily Trust and do the proper investigation. But by precluding that, taking over the premises with soldiers in truckloads and ransacking it, carrying away human beings, abducting journalists and abducting their computers, we create the impression that we're a lawless country. And we should not do that. And that really, for me, is the biggest human rights problem that the current administration has created.
All right, what should we do? Do we fold our arms whereby the government then becomes judge, jury, and executioner. What should Nigerians do, and what should civil societies be doing at this point in time where we're seeing these things actually go out of hand?
Well, we're doing part of what we should do, which is calling attention to it on programs like yours. I think we can do more. And everybody needs to do more. The government, to begin with, needs to exercise greater restraint and understand that power is temporary. At the very most, President Buhari will do 8 years. After that, he's obliged to quit unless he wants to procure third term like his military predecessor, President Obasanjo. But if not, he's got no more than another 4 years if he wins the next election. That means people need to be careful. They need to understand that one day they will not be in power, and when they are not in power, things can go wrong. So you need to set the right examples. Judges need to do more. The specter of, there are good judges, but there are also very corrupt judges. And we need to get rid of the corrupt judges. And you see that the evidence of corrupt judges in the argument that we have that somehow we should have special courts and special judges trying corruption cases. And my answer to that has always been, if we cannot trust every judge to do corruption cases, then those judges we cannot trust to do corruption cases should be fired because they're not good enough to be judges. Now, so we've got corrupt judges. We've also got corrupt lawyers, okay? Because now we've got a situation in which you were telling me about the Nigerian Bar Association criticizing what the government is doing, rightfully so. But we also have a situation in which the president of the Nigerian Bar Association, for the very first time, has been arraigned for money laundering charges, and he's still in office. Meanwhile, when the judges were arrested by the SSS in 2016 on allegations of corruption and money laundering, the same Nigerian Bar Association insisted that the judges had to be excused from sitting, that they should be suspended from sitting until they were cleared. Meanwhile, the president of the Bar Association, who's been arraigned on the same charges that the judges were arraigned, is doing what? He's presiding over the Nigerian Bar Association. It's this kind of hypocrisy and dishonesty that makes it difficult for government to take us seriously. Those who want to tell government what it should or should not do should also live to certain standards of probity. And at the moment, the Nigerian Bar Association is not doing that.
Let's look at the issue of fake news. Just yesterday, at an event, the Vice President did talk a lot about this, talking about how fake news, is eroding the believability of public information. How important is this to us as a country in this election period? How serious should we fight fake news?
To begin with, I'm glad that the Vice President is still married and that he survived his encounter with the strippers, allegedly. But seriously, I don't find the nomenclature, the template of fake news useful, and I will explain why. The notion of fake news actually conflates three different concepts, and for very selfish reasons. One is propaganda, two is mistake, and three is false news. Now, propaganda is a category that's always existed, and there's a way to fight it or respond to it. But everybody does it. Every so often, my good friend CP Jimo at police headquarters issues bulletins that are actually verifiably false. But nobody accuses him of fake news because the police monopolizes the prerogative to prosecute people for that kind of thing. And yet, my good friend Lai Mohammed at the Federal Ministry of Information now and again produces bulletins that are that have verifiably false content. Nobody accuses him of fake news. Why? The government does propaganda. Every so often, government does it everywhere in the world. Now, news gathering happens on the hoop. News gathering is very intense, and sometimes mistakes do happen. When mistakes do happen, that is not necessarily fake news. It's not false. It's just that things can fall through the cracks, and there are ways to correct that. And so I would not accuse someone who's made a mistake of being involved in fake news. And then there is false news, which is when people put out deliberately false information, believing that to be knowing that to be false. That is what people deal with when they're talking about fake news, but that's actually false news. Now, the whole template of fake news has been foisted on us by the current US president and his aversion for news except the one that pleases him. And my fear is that entities like BBC getting caught up in organizing workshops on fake news will fall into propagandizing for people like President Trump. And so I don't find the category of fake news very useful, and most of the people who use the notion of fake news are doing it for self-serving purposes. The example the vice president gave was a question of spinning, actually, you know, at the very worst, propaganda. And what we need to address is false news, the manufacture of deliberately false information for the purpose of misleading people into thinking that that is true. And if you notice, the British government actually, as a matter of policy, does not use the notion of fake news. Their official policy position is that fake news is not a useful category or a useful template. And I'd like to suggest that respectable outlets like Arise should not get caught up in the psychosis over fake news. It is called false news.
All right, I don't know how this will be managed in Nigeria because social media has a big role in managing information here in Nigeria. In the propagation, rather, of false information.
I didn't quite get that.
I said, I don't know how this will be managed because social media has a big role in the propagation of false information here in Nigeria.
Yes, social media, in fact, does have its negative dimensions, and that includes the propagation of information that is not necessarily true and could be false. But I actually think that the role of social media in the propagation of false news is overestimated and overblown. The biggest source of false news is government. When the military puts out bulletins that are verifiably inaccurate and then people propagate it, and when you contest it, you are criminalized. And when Amnesty International tries to put out right information, they are criminalized. And when UNICEF tries to put out the right information, they are threatened with expulsion. When humanitarians try to put out the right information, they're threatened with expulsion. When the police puts out verifiably false information, or when other departments of government put out verifiably false information, that is the biggest source of false news. And then what happens? The people who contest that information with more truthful information are not given benefit of good faith. Rather, their patriotism and citizenship is questioned. If you're Nigerian, or if you're Nigerian enough, why would you say information that our military puts out is wrong? Why would you say information that our security services put out is not accurate? Why would you say police information is not accurate? But you can show, actually, that it is not accurate. In the 21st century, it's not that difficult to do so. So the first thing, can government at least hew to facts? If government were to hew to facts, citizens would have good examples to follow. And then government would have the moral high ground to prosecute citizens who are dealing in false information. That, for me, is the biggest issue. Most people don't get their information from social media as much as we would like to think otherwise. Most people get their information from radio, from TV, from newspapers, which monopolize platforms, not from people who have massive, not even from people who have massive followerships. And if you look at Nigerians with massive social media followerships, I'll take an example, Linda Ikeji. Linda propagates information that's on another platform. She's not a primary news provider. She's an aggregator. Aggregators have their roles, but aggregators rely on primary providers. And that is where the problem is. Government provides over 60% of what is called false information. We need to deal with that.
Rightly so. Dr. Odinkalu, let's go back to the issue of insecurity. We have seen a resurgence of Boko Haram activities and increase in crime and criminality in some other states, including Zamfara. Do you foresee a situation where elections will be postponed in those areas? Because INEC has also said that conducting in the Northeast, especially in the Northeast, INEC has said that conducting elections in such areas, in that region in particular, will be based on security reports. So do you foresee us postponing elections in such areas?
I don't know, is my honest answer, and I lack the powers or capability to hold forth on those issues. There are institutions and authorities who have responsibility for that, and I hope that at the right time, they will take the right decision in the public interest, always in the public interest. Now, I will only speak to this as a Nigerian who has friends and family who work on elections. And I will ask myself the question, if my child or my sister or brother were to be deployed to organize elections in Birnin Gwari or in Kaduna State or in a place like Lao or in a place like in any of the places in Zamfara outside Gusau, would I encourage the person to go? I suspect not. Now, the other way to look at it is to ask how many insurance companies actually will be happy and willing to provide insurance cover on current information to INEC staffers who, life insurance cover to INEC staffers who will be deployed to do elections in Zamfara or in any of these spots. If we cannot answer that question happily, then we know we have a problem. Those are the two parameters with reference to which I try to answer that question. INEC has a responsibility to provide life insurance cover for every member of INEC who is going to be, every staff, including ad hoc staff who will be involved in the elections. If insurance companies are unwilling or unable to provide that cover across the board to every staff in certain locations, we should know that there is a difficulty in that place.
Are you convinced and confident that there would be a free, fair, and credible elections in 2019?
The jury is out at the moment on that. I hope INEC can give us enough information on the basis of which to answer that question. INEC has released the information on voters. But if you look at the guidelines, you will see that there are 4 conditions that anybody needs to fulfill in order to be eligible to vote. You've got to be a citizen, an adult, a Nigerian, you've got to be on the voters roll, and you've got a PVC. At the moment, INEC has provided information on the number of registered voters, 18.04 million. But it has not, 18.004 million. But it's not provided information on the number of PVCs that have been collected and their distribution. So, and eligibility to vote is not based on presence on the voters roll. It is based on possession of a PVC. So we'll have to await information on the PVC. Now, I've also got to say that demographic management by INEC and by Nigeria generally has been problematic with elections. If you notice, in 2011, we had roughly 74 million voters. It's 73.7 or thereabouts million voters. By 2015, we had gone down to just under 68 million voters. Now we're 84 million voters. Populations don't yo-yo like that, but that's where we are. And so we need the population of people who have PVCs in order to calculate who is eligible to vote and who isn't. The other thing is that lots of people are on the roll who should not be there. I'll give you one example. My father, God bless his soul, died in December 2015. He's still on the voters roll. I've got 2 other dead uncles who died in 2015 and 2016 who are on the voters roll. And so some of these numbers, the Nigerian electoral roll is a one-way traffic. It's like Hotel California, yeah? There is only exit, there's no checkout. And because there's no checkout, you really cannot be very trustworthy of the numbers on our electoral register. So let's see what's there when they release the numbers on PVC collection, and then we'll see what happens. There are lots of other things we've discussed this morning, including the the voting settlements and stuff like that, which will have a bearing, and collation and results transmission, which have a bearing on the reliability and credibility of the elections. And until we have some convincing evidence of how those will be run, I don't think it's accurate at the moment, or sensible at the moment, or prudent to begin to hold forth on whether the elections will be free and fair. I like to hope, however, that the officials and the institutions care enough about the country to understand that if we mess up with our elections, we're messing up with the country.
All right, Dr. Odinkalu, as we try to wrap up today, what is your biggest fear leading up to the elections?
Violence. In one word, violence. The related factor is the neutrality of the security services, particularly the police, because the police is the biggest single security institution in the country, and it's got the widest footprint. If the security services don't behave responsibly and with neutrality, there are enough arms in private hands in the country to create a free-for-all killing field, and I don't think anybody should pray for that.
Many thanks, Dr. Chidi Odinkalu, for the time this morning on the show. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and Happy New Year again.
Great. Well, let's now news. Emmanuel Ifini join us with a review of the top stories on today's newspapers. Please stay with us.